Well, hello, and welcome back to the Patristica YouTube channel. Today, I'm joined by my fellow co-host, Marcus Vincent, and a special guest, Dr. Shawn Wilhite, who is going to be talking to us a bit today about the Didache, and more specifically, this book, which he published some years ago. Link in the description if you want to buy it. Shawn is a name that I came across because of this book, and we'll talk about it later, but he's inspired my, hopefully, third monograph, if I ever get round to finishing the first two. And indeed, he has two PhDs for his sins, one in God's own country in Durham. And he's currently Associate Professor of New Testament at, remind which university you're at? Sorry, I definitely should have written that down.
That's okay. California Baptist University, Southern California.
And is also a series editor for studies of patristic theology and spirituality at the with Baylor University Press, and is currently working on Cyril of Alexandria's Trinitarian theology, of which I'm sure a great work will eventually emerge. So, Shawn, why don't you tell us a bit about why you wrote this book about the Didache, this commentary, and how you got into studying it, and what your thoughts are, some preliminary thoughts about what the Didache is, maybe who wrote it, and maybe even, dare I say, give us a date.
Indeed. First off, just grateful to be able to talk with both of you. And looking forward to whatever we get to learn together and get to kind of explore several of these ideas together. So I feel like my world is split into two. There's a little bit of biblical studies, 1st and 2nd century, and then theological studies within 4th and 5th century literature. So with that, I have my biblical studies world, so to speak, where I kind of pursued those thoughts, those questions as related to Didache, and then more or less theological. And that's where I went with, that's when I studied at Durham with Professor Louis Ayres, honed and sharpened more or less theological abilities within early Christian texts. Okay, so I'll attempt my best at Didache questions. It is a mess. It doesn't feel like we're circling on some of the big essential questions or narrowing in on some of the essential questions. So I ended up writing this commentary by accident. It didn't feel like it was I set out to do it. When I was working on my thesis, I was looking at the two ways literature and wanted to focus in on the Didache. So my monograph on Didache and the two ways was predominantly the focus of my attention, trying to situate the two ways literature. I'm not even going to call it text or traditions. I'm going to get into that a little bit later. Just the nomenclature is a bit, there's nuances to both of those. One of the things I was noticing is that each time a two ways text would pop up, you would see angelic mediators, you would see a little bit of cosmology language, whether or not it's extensive or a little bit. And then a couple other things. In that monograph, I list out 5 to 6 key elements that's proper to the two ways text. And one of the things I noticed, the Didache doesn't have those features. My question was why, my question was what, and then it eventually went to why. The commentary, honestly, was me trying to make sense of the text, the Didache text, and me trying to make sense of its coherence. Like, is there a message to this? And one of the things we're going to talk about, I'm sure, is that it's a stitched document. It's just, it feels stitched together. So is coherence an actual possibility? Is kind of a question that does need to be raised. So as I'm working on that thesis, then later turned into monograph, in the background, I'm making notes and collecting resources, trying to put together arguments. And I step back from that monograph only to realize I have about 20,000 words here that I think we can turn into a small commentary, and ended up approaching Whitfinstock with it. And we put together a small series. The commentary as a whole is not meant to compete with Niederweimer's work with Hermeneia. Forgive me. There's there's a German series as well that Niederweimer's originally in, and then it was translated into English into Hermeneia. It's not meant to compete with that, but I'm aiming to provide literary readings, and so it's a bit different than simply asking the social questions, the historical critical questions. Try to be sensitive to it, and only to come to the end of it thinking, I don't know how to do this well. But at the end of the day, we only have an 11th century manuscript, and so just trying to what is the literary coherence, if that's possible, and the theological topics that link together within the document.
And I suppose then the first question is for people who don't really know what the Didache is. Can you summarize, however succinctly as you can, what, and that's not an easy task, and again, we'll come on to why later,
I understand
what the text actually is and who it purports to be written by, because that's also a really important part of the text.
Yeah, so the Nancy Pardee, forgive my not remembering the title, but she talks about the genre and development of the text. Essentially, any assessment of the text, I think I want to just humbly suggest it's like a must read, kind of working through that monograph. She's absolutely brilliant. Comes from University of Chicago. In her work, she does kind of a linguistic assessment kind of the text, and then attempts to talk about the genre of the text, which almost proves quite difficult because part of her findings is there's roughly, give or take, 4 big divisions within the text. You have chapters 1 through 6, which would be considered the 2 ways traditions. You then have the liturgical sections where it talks about baptism, the hypocrites as it echoes. I don't want to say it's dependent upon, but echoes Matthean Sermon on the Mount literature. Uses what would be known as the Lord's Prayer, the longer doxology that is, I think, found its way in tradition, actually comes from the Didache. The doxology to the Lord's Prayer, and then you have actual Eucharistic liturgies. After that, you then have a longer section on traveling apostles and prophets. Then it ultimately ends with what some would refer to as an apocalyptic or eschatological type conclusion that seems to not fully finish. So it's been suggested that the text either is corrupted at the end or has been lost. So because it feels it ends too abruptly. We can get into that later. So the question is what is the Didache? At the base level, it's the teaching, as just reference to the Greek word. The longer title is the teachings of the Lord to the Gentiles, which, if there's a Matthean connection, which I would suggest that there is, in terms of a Matthean-like community, then it's very possible that the Didachist writer, I almost want to suggest a Didachist editor, may or may not be building upon the end of Matthew. So this notion of Gentiles, teachings to the nations, instruction, bears with it similarities to the end of Matthew. An argument against that, however, is that if there's awareness of Matthew in the Didache, it's exclusive to Matthew 6. And so in that, so there's I'm trying to put an argument against my hypothesis in that sense. So I actually don't know how to answer what is it, because if my hypothesis holds, it's a multi-stitched document then each stitch, so to speak, would have served the community in different ways. What is most offered is that it's a catechumen document. But even the catechumen document doesn't fully hold when we're looking at the latter two sections of the traveling apostles and the eschatological section. It makes sense of the two ways tradition, simply because not Matthew 7, Didache 7 begins with, after you have reviewed these things, which most likely could be a reference back to Didache 1-6, which is the ethical treatises. So after you've reviewed these things, then pursue baptism. So at least some of the document is catechumen in nature. Some of the document is liturgical. And one of the interesting things, this is a side note, so please get me back on track. One of the interesting things is liturgical studies in general and how to assess liturgy and its dating, because liturgy sort of just pushes pause on development because it provides a fixture to the community. So when what it later becomes known as the Didache was this liturgical material. That's another hard question to answer that I don't know. I feel agnostic to it. I don't know how to answer it, but I don't know if it's almost possible to answer it. And it's the latter half that I sort of don't know how to define, because it's not necessarily meant for a catechumen. Sections 1 and 2 could be catechumen in nature, but I'm not quite sure what to do with parts 3 and 4 if we're going to hold to the catechumen like a document.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
So sorry not to answer your question.
It's so funny because one of my students who read it for the first time described it as a hodgepodge of gobbledygook. And I don't think the gobbledygook bit was fair, but I definitely think the hodgepodge bit is very fair.
Yes.
Just before we continue, we've got a question from one of our viewers, which is just, what is the two ways text? What do you mean by the two ways? I suppose for those who haven't read it or aren't particularly familiar with it, that's a great question. Do you want to just give a quick summation of that?
Yeah, so that's really good. And I alluded to it earlier, two ways text versus two ways tradition. It's one of the set of distinctions that I tried to argue in my monograph. Generally, the two ways idea is ethical in nature, whereby the author puts before a reader two pathways or two models of life that one is good, one is bad. The one that is good will have a particular set of ethics. The one that is bad has a particular set of vices. So with the Didache, it literally begins, there are two ways of life. One of the ways is life. The other way is death. And then the Didachist will spend 4 chapters defining what is the way of life, and then ultimately conclude with 1 chapter on the vices related to the ways of death. So it's quite possible that the two ways could be ethical, paranetic, or wisdom-like in its nature.
And I think you may add that a lot of this material alludes at least to the Sermon of the Mount.
Oh, yes.
So it's like cut and paste, I feel, from various places, organized according to those two possible ways one could choose.
Oh, yes. No, very much so. Yeah, very much so.
And I suppose that in many ways makes the next question I'm about to ask, and alluded to earlier, really difficult to answer. And I've always found it a very funny thing when I read in books people trying to date the Didache, because I almost feel like that is trying to date the impossible, in the sense of, you've alluded to it several times, that you're dealing with a hodgepodge, as we've colloquially termed it, of things. And even before we come to trying to date a text, we have to evidence its integrity as a singular text, and if we can't, then we have to break it down and date individual pieces. And so I suppose that my question is, how did you go about, or have you also concluded this is a possible task, gone about dating it? Because estimates for Didache range so widely from from sort of the middle to the first century all the way to yesterday, basically. So how did you go about that task, and have you come to any sort of decision?
Yeah, so let me try to muddy the water real quick and then try to clear us up. We only have one full manuscript of the Didache, and it dates to the 11th century. There are two fragments of one of chapter 2 and 3. Two and forgive me. 1 and 2, 1 and 3. Forgive me, I'm spacing on that real quick. And then there's stuff related to the liturgies. There's another fragment text that's related to the liturgies. There was a Gregorian translation at the turn of the 20th century. However, this one has an interesting tradition behind it. As soon as it was beholden, it was then lost, and therefore no one has really seen it, but we have heard rumors of it. And so we're trying our best with one manuscript that dates to the 11th century, but it sounds like it's referenced back to older centuries. So if we only had one Matthew manuscript that was 10 centuries separated from the actual events, like it's hard to have the, I don't want to use the language of historical veracity, but it's hard to put those types of categories into it because you have such a big and large historical gap. So what I attempted to do was listen to the majority of Didache scholars on the matter. There are generally three big positions. One will hold that the Didache precedes the Gospel of Matthew, and therefore the evangelist used the Didache to help construct Matthew. So that's option one. Option number two is that it was written concurrent with Matthew traditions. The position number three would be it comes after Matthew. So the majority of Didache scholars will at least anchor it to Matthean and gospel studies. What I attempted to use was the language of a window, that the window of possibility could be the end of the first century, if not the beginning of the second century. So I probably am on the latter. I probably push it later, I think, than most, but it still doesn't feel late. Second thing to muddy up real quick is that when I say the Didachist, I actually don't mean one editor. And that's the harder thing to think through as well, because of the stitching. And when I say late first century, early second century, I actually don't mean the Didache chapters 1 to 16. I simply mean the majority of the Didache of 1 to 16. There's an article that Clayton Jefford is another name within Didache studies. He himself is working on kind of a big project on that. I won't reveal too much there. But we presented him a festschrift, so that's coming out with Brill later this summer. And one of the arguments that I made, one of my article was looking at Didache 1 and trying to make the argument that it's a second or third century edition. So part of the material in Didache 1 comes to us maybe late third century. So with that, I'm making the argument that some of the material of Didache 1 is being added to or stitched into the Didache. So the question is really, when does Didache become Didache? Because it is old traditions that are then later stitched together and then at some point it's recognized as Didache, and I would just put it as humbly, softly, with an open hand, loosely, late first century, early second century, that what we know as Didache is still evolving, but a good majority of it's there.
Let me also ask, because you mentioned the Greek tradition, what do you make with the Ethiopic and the Coptic fragments that we have?
Man, yes. Oh, so glad you mentioned
that. How
do
you relate to
that? Yep. those are hard things. One of the interesting things in that is that if you take the Coptic and place it side by side to what's known as H54, they don't match. And so I don't know if I could say that there's two Didaches being out there, but I don't want to say that. But there's enough that it's not matching that I feel critically hesitant to say that it's the same text. It would be similar to the Doctrina, the Latin Doctrina, where it's not Didache, but it has Didache-like material in it, which might communicate to the antiquitous nature of the two ways. And it was reshaped several ways, but you bring up the question that's so difficult to do this, because once you start putting the Coptic next to the H54, it doesn't match. There's enough symmetry to say, okay, there's a similar tradition here, but they're different enough to note that it's not the same.
And
just to follow up on that one before Jack hops in.
Please.
Because I was asking that because whenever I make use of the Didache, from all the editions that are out there and translations, I preferred Klaus Wengst.
Oh, yes.
Edition.
Yes.
Because he relies more on the Ethiopic and Coptic tradition and shows that as the Didache has undergone what he calls a gospelization.
Yes.
I mean, a lot of material, particularly from Matthew, that not all of it, but a good deal of the material from Matthew, which is in the Greek manuscript, the H54 from the 11th century, is missing in the Ethiopic and Coptic tradition. Yes. And now Klaus makes the same argument, which I've made in other circumstances. How on earth would a Coptic pious monk, or an even more pious Ethiopic monk, pick out Matthean material from a text which would carry it? Right. So I think this is a difficult one, and that's why Klaus then opted for passages rather with the Coptic and Ethiopic. Now, those parallels not only run, as you know, along the two ways. Yeah, we also have the same parallels with regards, for example, the Lord's Prayer, and there you can see, even when you compare the Ethiopic with the Coptic one, one of the traditions is more gospelized than the other one.
Yes.
So, last question to fix that. When we then think that the Greek manuscripts, as you mentioned before, dates from the 11th century, which in principle I think I have no problem with, because I mean, manuscripts are from the time when we get them. And however, that should not undermine a manuscript standing in the first instance. However, in this particular case, as you know, we have an even bigger problem. Yeah. Because next to it, I mean, this is a collection of more or less second century literature. Well, literature we place into the second century, right? Okay, and with it comes, of course, Jack's friend Ignatius, yeah.
Yes.
And here we get to an Ignatius which is not only because it's the 13-letter collection, that wouldn't be a problem, but it is an Ignatius which is thoroughly biblicized or biblicized.
Oh yes. Oh yes.
So it has undergone, as if somebody with a Bible, in particular with the New Testament, had rollen over an older text. Yeah.
Yes.
Because when you compare the 13 letters, of which 6 have been added in the 4th century,
Yes.
if you compare that with the 7 letters, which have barely any links to the New Testament or the Old Testament, now every second phrase is a quote from the New Testament or from the Old Testament.
Yes.
Now, if the Didache, in comparison with the Coptic Ethiopic tradition, also shows sign of gospelization in that manuscript, if we only took the case that it was 50% only gospelized of what Ignatius has been gospelized, probably not a single gospel verse would be left in the Didache. So if we say it was only 10% as gospelized as the Ignatius, then we probably come to the status of the Coptic and the Ethiopic, still not of the Greek one. So that's my question.
Yes, and unfortunately, I don't have answers because. And you raise a question that it raises a question for me, your question that to study H54 and the
entire manuscript.
Yes, so looking at H54 rather than looking at as you mentioned, the longer recension of Ignatius and what is then later known as the Didache. Like the books, the works are often studied in isolation rather than looking at kind of the manuscript as a whole to kind of look at several of those features that I would love to pitch this. I would love to see a thesis on said idea.
And it's exactly what happens also from the 3 letters of Ignatius to the 7 letters of Ignatius in the short and middle recension. It's not just the middle to the long, but also the short to the middle, where all of these biblical quotes in the short recension are magically vanished. And Marcus brings up the exact point, which I think is so important, is which crazy monk following a proto-Catholic or even other heretical sect, would take out not just even biblical quotes if they might disagree about what canon they might use, but just the name of Jesus or just the term Christ. And this is what we're dealing with, is like people are taking away things that are fundamentals of almost every Christian sect, regardless of their niche. And that whole thing about, the trust in H54 has always frightened me for that reason. Although I do think, again, with you both, that, we shouldn't be scared of 11th century manuscripts, because manuscripts are, you can't judge it by the fact that that's what it was. So one of the things that we talk a lot about on this podcast, because of the project we're working on with Mark Bilby, who unfortunately is not with us today, is the ordering of Gospels. And with particular reference to Marcion's Gospel, because of Marcus, obviously. And I think that one of the really interesting things that I'd like to put to you is that, assuming the current model that most scholars work off with either a Markan priority and then whether you take the Farrer hypothesis or Q or whatever, the Didache can fit that dating of late 1st, early 2nd, at least the sources of it, though at least those Matthean elements. But when it comes to our model, and Marcus and Shawn, I'd be interested to see maybe a bit of a discussion here and back and forth. Our model would suggest that the Didache, or at least those parts that reference Matthew, must be late. In fact, considerably late, maybe towards the later 2nd century rather than the late 1st. And so using the 2 models, I wonder which one both of you think could make more sense, because I think that there is a problem with current Didache scholarship that they're saying it references Matthew, but there seems to be very little I can see of Matthew anywhere else in the Apostolic Fathers and in early Christianity. And once you take away the Didache and indeed the middle recension of Ignatius, you're sort of left with emptiness, a big blank zone. So what are your thoughts on that?
Let me add one element which hasn't been mentioned yet, which I think would be of interest. It's the relation between the Didache and Paul.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah,
yes,
absolutely. Okay.
yes, yes, indeed.
I'd be wondering what you think about this relation, because that's also important for if we want to raise the question of dating and placing these texts.
Right.
What do you think about this relation?
Oh, goodness. Okay. So Alan Garrow, Didache scholar, has written on Didache essentially coming about before Matthew. So Matthew's dependent upon Didache. One of the things that he has been doing is not necessarily answering the direct question that you're raising, but at least looking at gospel studies, gospel critical studies, and the concept of Didache. And so someone is looking at that. I would part ways with Alan in terms of the order, Didache preceding Matthew. I want to see Didache coming after Matthew, and I realize that would need to be proven if he and I were in dialogue. And he's such a generous person anyway. I don't know if any of you have met him. I'm unfamiliar, admittedly, with Marcion literature and gospel studies, and so I would be remiss to say, as I answer the question, I know I'm gonna miss a couple of things because I'm not familiar as much with Marcion's concept of gospel ordering. One of the things you do bring up, though, is that if Didache is removed, and we only assume the middle recension, Matthew is roughly absent. Yeah, that's a good question that I don't know if I've considered, only because I generally ask theological questions, and so I haven't really asked that more historical ordering question. The concept of Paul, that is an interesting one, simply because there could be one reference of 1 Thessalonians in Didache 16, and outside of that, there's no Pauline references in in part number 3 of the Didache, which would be the traveling apostles. There's several quotations. I don't want to exaggerate. Forgive me. There's a couple quotations of Hebrew Bible, namely Malachi chapter 1 is being quoted in reference to the Eucharist, and then Zechariah. Might be Zechariah 12 or Zechariah 14 is then quoted in Didache 16. So when it comes to what texts, so to speak, or what traditions does the Didachist view authoritatively, it doesn't feel like a lot. And so one of the arguments that I tried to make in the early accounts of the Didache, where Sermon on the Mount material is more present, after I state this hypothesis, I actually don't know what to do with the hypothesis after it. But the majority of the majority of language and is Matthew in nature, but Lucan in order. So it doesn't follow Matthew's order, even though there is several Matthean languages, words and phrases from Matthew that are shared. But the Didachist will break Matthew's order frequently to follow Lucan order of Sermon on the Mount. So again, beyond that, I don't know. My thoughts on this have yet to mature enough to know what to do next with that set of data. I feel like I'm talking around your questions because several of them.
No, it's not talking around. It's precise thing, because it matches my own reading.
Yeah.
I couldn't find any clear reference even not a hinting at Pauline material.
Yes. Yeah.
Which brings me to, of course, another topic, but which is still in order to set this text somehow, right? Because people have always said, well, it can't be too late, because let's say after Irenaeus, I'd say after Tertullian, I mean, in the 3rd century, let's say. And that's why I liked when you were saying, well, you place it probably into the 3rd century. I mean, at least the reduction you look at, because after Irenaeus, I think with Tertullian and others, a Pauline reference or Pauline material has become widespread.
Oh yes.
Before Irenaeus, it is very reluctant to find Pauline material. Look at Justin, Hermas, quite a number of people who one wonders why there is no Pauline material. Maybe there are hints there, but there's no clear reference, right? But how I came to the whole topic, I mean, even to Marcion, was a simple question like yourself, because I came, like you, from the 4th, 5th century.
Okay.
That's where I've worked on for 25 years. I've stayed away from the 2nd century because I thought I don't need a mess, right? I love clear ideas, and so and I liked also theological ideas. So I thought, no, stay away from textual studies in 2nd century. Anyway, I ended up, because I had to give a paper, and I thought it's an easy deal to write about Christ's resurrection in the 2nd century.
Okay. Yes.
And here I read your text, and there's nothing. Well, how can it be?
There's nothing.
There is baptism, there is Eucharist, there's the Lord's Prayer, there is Sunday, there are apostles and prophets, and even you say there's a catechetical entrance at least. So we are bringing people into the new Christian movement.
Yes.
There's Christ, well, not his name, but at least here's a story about him being incarnate, but there is no resurrection of him. No. How can
even
you're Baptist, come.
That's right.
No resurrection, no belief, right?
That's right. Oh goodness,
so
that's right.
Where are we?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And there's no the language that I think I used in the commentaries, that there's no cross theology. Like there's no mention of even death in the concept of the Eucharist liturgies.
And you see, the theologians have crucified me for writing a book which only stated one thing.
Yes.
When in the 2nd century and for the 1st century we can in the first 2 centuries, right? Where we have writings that know Paul, they talk about Christ's resurrection.
Oh yes,
and where we have writings who do not display any knowledge of Paul, there's no resurrection of Christ. But we cannot say that these are not Christian texts.
Yes, no, indeed, right.
So if these are Christian texts, what do we make of it?
Yes,
that's the whole book which I wrote, and then I thought, how can it be, that Christ's resurrection rises with Paul's coming to the fore? That was my question, and I couldn't answer that. So for the last 25 years, I was puzzling with this.
Oh, interesting. Only to offer a question back, because that is so intriguing. How did you engage with First Clement and the Phoenix tradition?
Look, that's an easy one. First Clement quotes Paul, knows Paul, quotes First Corinthians, and talks about Christ's resurrection.
Yeah. Okay.
But go for Hermas. He has 10 titles for Christ. Yeah. And for Christ's sake, he doesn't say anything about Christ the risen one.
That's right.
60 chapters.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh,
no
man.
Paul, no resurrection.
Yeah. I'm so glad you read it. It's one of those books I want to stay away from. Oh, wow. That's fantastic. Yeah, it's such an interesting set of ideas right there. Yeah.
Do you think, and again, this comes back to Marcus's thing. I am very much a student of the Dr. Vata. And one of the questions I always ask is whether a text is at all enigmatic in its theology and its what you perceive to be its practical theology. And assuming the Didache, and I don't think this, but let's say we do place it at the end of the first century, beginning of the second. Do you think it's in line with other texts that you suppose are of that date, or do you think it proposes more of a unique and distinct style? I think also here of Alan Brent's book on Ignatius of Antioch and the Second Sophistic, that he shows Ignatius to be an absolute loony in the middle recension compared to his peers. Yeah. And I wondered whether you thought the Didache also, because I think the Didache, again, if it is late first century, is enigmatic, but I just wondered what your thoughts were about that.
Yeah. The first... I don't know if I have a direct answer, but the question that I'd want to pursue is how we understand Didache 1-6 to Barnabas 18-20.
Which is a necessary question.
Yeah, because in that sense, it's not enigmatic. Because Barnabas is close enough to Didache 1-6 to show something of awareness, maybe. I want to say that loosely, but it only knows chapters 1-6. So again, it goes back to the stitching idea. So Didache 1-6 probably isn't enigmatic because of that. The liturgical section, I would almost say no again, because it's simply just trying to reiterate Matthew chapter 6. The traveling prophets. Yeah, I don't know. I was in conversation with somebody the other day who's writing on Didache material, and this person says they just don't know what to do with that third section. Because it does shift. Like the first part of it is a model, and then the second part of that third it shifts again in the traveling apostles and prophets. However, if once you stitch it all together, yes, it's enigmatic because it now causes a reader at some point to read it coherently. The question is, when was it meant to be read coherently? Yeah. And to that, I don't have a question. I don't have an answer to that. But I would still say, because of the absence of Paul, I wouldn't fix the date for the stitching of that text much later than the beginning of the 3rd century. Yes, and I think
from that time onwards, I think once you've got a text which is being seen from the outsiders as a text, then it develops a kind of stability, which doesn't mean that that it's still possible that the redactor comes along, as with the Ignatian letters, or as with the Pauline letters as well, to stitch 3, 4, or 6 new letters to an existing corpus. It is more difficult once a text has got a title and has got some kind of a redaction and a scope, right? So that once you've got, let's say, those 4 sections of a text, to entirely remove, you can even see later when these texts like the Didache or the Didascalia are being transferred and encompassed in bigger collections, they still stay pretty stable.
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
Yes. A moment ago, I forgive me for interrupting you a moment ago, but I was gonna raise the apostolic constitutions. And you just alluded to the other comparable, the Didascalia, where both the Didascalian Apostolic Constitutions are more developed than the Didache. So at least those portions of the Didache predate. I would say that they predate those elements. And so I appreciate that idea.
So I think it's only fair then to let the viewers in on what I'm doing next, because like I said, it was this book, again, link in the description if you want to buy it, that sort of inspired me. So one of the things that I think is at the core of this, because the manuscript tradition is so difficult to work out, and again, viewers of the channel will know that one of our big things here is computational linguistics with our colleague Mark Bilby and our background colleague Lance. And we have been doing this with the Apostolos and the Pauline canonical Paul. Also, I did it with Ignatius. And so to next, I figured that the Didache might be a good target for such an inquiry, looking at things like small words, looking at things, not just, again, big thematic changes, etc. To look at whether we could, what Mark calls the echoes of the bird song or whatever. He has this great poetry phrase for it. But to see if we can discern voices of authors. And you've mentioned a few times, and again, I think this is really important, that this is a stitching together. How many voices do you think could be a part of this? How I mean, it's almost an impossible question without the data to back you. But
I understand.
Obviously, we have the two ways tract, or the two way vitae. Then we have some liturgical stuff. We have stuff about bishops and deacons. We have stuff about apostles and teachers and all these sorts of figures. How many reductions do you think it could have gone through? And if the answer is I don't know, how else do you think we can go about methodologically working this out, apart from this computational linguistics business? Or is that a question that is a bit far removed from the theology that you're doing?
No, and it's interesting, because what this conversation is doing is that it's revealing how I'm attempting to navigate several of the critical questions that won't appear in here, because the book is predominantly trying to look at its literary coherence. But you've already heard me say it's a stitched document, so how can I argue for literary coherence? It's just like at some point you just read the document, and that's what I'm attempting to do in the commentary. My goodness, I want to hide behind Nancy Pardee and say go read her book, because honestly she attempts to answer that question. But again, you'll have several. I don't want to say several. You'll have a small group of scholars who will say it's written by one author, one sitting, one community, all the way up to several authors, several hands, several communities. I would be the latter, but again, I don't know how to divvy up that camp, in the sense of, are there 2 Didache redactors? Are there 10? What did the community as a whole do? Was it the leader of the community? Was it, I don't know. And not that, I don't know if it's possible to know, but my interests don't, my questions don't go that direction. So I've yet to fully tease that idea out.
Yeah, I mean, I totally empathize that. I mean, it was not my question either when I began looking at these Christian texts, because I just had sort of figured out that I trust on the scholarship that had been done previously. Yeah. But the problem was I worked out with Ignatius that this was no longer possible. So again, I'm hoping that I might attack the Didache and it comes out quite well, and there's maybe 1 or maybe 2 voices, as if you want to call them those. But my fear is that there's going to be a real mess. And I think that one of the things that we're really passionate about on this channel is scholarship moving forward with the right text in the right time. I think that one of the difficulties that I often find, and this was true of my own work and still is that I often find that I rely so much on the traditional dating or the opinio communis of texts, the dating and authorship, and then when I go to look at it, I say, well, how is this evidence for that? I think particularly of the thing that solidified Lightfoot's consensus on the Ignatian Middle Recension, which is 17 pages, which he argues for the middle recension is authentic, and then waffles for 400 pages. And I thought, why? How has scholarship relied on this? And my theology of trying to work out the theology of the 1st, 2nd century was so skewed because I think Lightfoot made such a grave error. And that's why I think that these conversations are so important, is that, you know, I'm desperate. I'd much rather be on your team. I actually way prefer doing theology and all of those things, because I too am a Christian and I'd like to know what was going on, but I don't know what to do with texts that are just romanticized, I think is the way to put it.
Yeah, goodness. Yeah, this is not a fully fleshed out idea in my own mind, and I'm very much dependent upon Lewis for this concept. But he just came out with a chapter that makes the case that good historical theologians are also curators, in the sense that each act of curation is an act of putting texts together and in conversation with one another. And so I think you hit it right on the head, in the sense of, if we assume the small recension of Ignatius, it's going to produce a picture of Ignatius, versus if we assume the longer recension, it's going to produce a different picture. And so it's what text do we put, that we essentially curate, that we put in conversation with one another to try to understand the ideas therein.
To me, for example, because I'm just about to finish the reconstruction of this 10-letter collection, which is being credited to Marcion.
Oh,
and while I've done that, that's with the publisher at the moment. I'm writing at the moment a small monograph on the comparison between the two Pauline pictures that emerge from the 10-letter collection in contrast to the 14-letter collection. And one of the elements on which I wrote the last days was baptism, for example. Yeah, there is no baptism in the Marcionite New Testament. When he makes use of the word water, yeah, he uses thalasser instead of hydor. And of course, in the canonical tradition, hydor is very much loaded with baptism, and that's part of the Didache as a core central part. Yeah, and one wonders when you read a Pauline text of 10 letters, yeah, where Christian baptism doesn't appear, and where the word baptizein appears only in relation to washing your hands before dinner. Yeah. So things. If you then bring these things in relation to each other, right? You can see a transition, I think, if we assume that at least the dating of these 10 letters, if that's at the latest mid-2nd century, canonical collection is later in the 2nd century, I think then I would have a bit of room for the Didache to be, let's say, I would then be able to put it as a stitched document in the arena of late Justin, yeah? Because then we would have a comparative text who knows Paul but doesn't make use of Paul, who has liturgical parts, gives us a bit of knowledge about the Eucharist, and yeah. Whereas I think early in the 2nd century, I wouldn't see that. And indeed, I'd love to talk about theology, and that's just by the side, which I've just done yesterday and today, right? I noticed because one of our listeners, a lady, said, "Well, if your reconstruction holds, right, then there is no forgiveness of sin in Paul." And I've checked that yesterday and today, and there is no forgiveness of sin in the entire pre-canonical New Testament. So in Marcion's New Testament, you don't have the notion that that there is any forgiveness of sin.
Oh wow, that's so intriguing.
Yeah, and when you look into the canonical New Testament. You have it not in all places, but you have it in Mark, you have it in Matthew, yeah. You have less in Luke probably, but you have it also in Luke, and you have it in the in Acts, of course, yeah, and you have it in some other writings. So it becomes a core feature, I think, of the canonical text, yeah. But it does not feature at all.
Yeah, interesting. Within Marcion's, yeah, Marcion's. Oh, fantastic. Yeah. Well, yeah, I look forward to seeing that book when it comes out.
Which is such an important feature for Christians today, right? I mean, it's
for
part
sure.
of the creed.
No, indeed. Yeah, I wouldn't even know where to begin to begin thinking through that.
Well, Shawn, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Yes.
A real pleasure, and you've been so generous with your time. And just one last plug: do go and buy his book, because it really did give me a good entry into the Didache. I think you're right at the beginning that it's set for mid-level.
Mid-level, yes.
And I think it's slightly above that, actually. I think it's really good. It's really well written.
That. It's
really coherent, and it's really easy to follow. So go and check it out.
Kind of you. Thank you. Yeah,
and as always, the link's in the description. Go and check out our Patreons and also our Twitter. Shawn's also on Twitter. I'll drop that down as well. And hopefully see you all soon. Shawn, Marcus, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Jack and Marcus, this was a delight, and thank you so much for letting me be a part of it.
Do we see each other in Oxford?
I hope so. I had hoped so, but because of naps in Oxford this year, Oxford is going to